Today's show is sponsored by Yafa Bay and her Spirit of Tepereth Metaphysical Marketplace, here to provide you and your naturally special gifts with guidance and support through your life's journey, providing you tools such as candles, incense, charms, jewelry, oils, crystals, and much more. Visit them at 1273 West Broad Street in Columbus, Ohio, or online at spiritoftepereth.com. You can find all our sponsors' information in the show notes on our website. Now let's start the show.
The controversial group leading the charge, ADOS, or the American Descendants of Slavery. The controversial group ADOS, or the American Descendants of the controversial group ADOS, the American Descendants of the controversial group ADOS.
Welcome to the Articles of ADOS podcast, a weekly show where we bring you undiscussed news, articles, and information important to the American descendants of slavery, our friends, and our allies. You can find us every Friday, 10 a.m. on WCRS 92.7 and 98.3 here in Columbus, Ohio. Or as always, you can listen on your favorite podcast app. This is episode 28. I'm your host, Lisa Todd, along with my co-host,
Daud GeAzan. On today's show, we will share articles from Black Enterprise, NPR, LA Times, ABC News, Breitbart, and the Associated Press. Later in the show, stay tuned for our main event, where we dive into and present the article entitled The Complicated Role of Black Leaders in Shaping the Criminal Justice System.
Personality. Peace. This week in our personality piece, I'm going to pose a question that forces us to have personalities.
Okay, what questions do you have for us this week?
Why is it so difficult to change things in America, locally and nationally? Specifically, unjust laws. Laws, policies, and procedures that we can clearly see are wrong or are discriminatory. For example, having voting locations that have a wait time of 4 to 5 hours to vote, and other locations where you can just walk in and out in 15 minutes. Same city, same state. That is absurd, and we know it. It must change, but how? People have been complaining about this for decades, and this is just one issue. There are thousands of issues where nothing is happening or changing.
Well, people have been complaining about that since the founding of the country, and just as I've shared many times about how the traffic lighting systems work in ways, the founding dead white male landowning fathers of the country designed a democracy that same way. They were somewhat fearful of democracy, and so they wanted checks and balances or designs put in place. The first biggest one was the only people that could vote were the landowning white males. And that was a way of restricting what the population needed so that their needs would supersede. People had to fight to get more. But again, more structure built more reasons for restrictions. And some of those restrictions are wait until it's time to vote. That's just a restriction. We've got more police charged with things who've stepped out of line and been inappropriate in the period where people have been protesting and didn't have to wait on nobody to vote on a sheriff or whatever. So a lot of the system is built to delay things so that the impetus and drives of the masses are delayed or dissipated and don't have as much impact when it comes time for voting, and therefore reduces the likelihood that things will change. So what does change things is mass action, organized mass action. And that's what is, what we're doing now.
Well, yeah, and that's just, what people tend to do is just wish things would change, and just wanting something to change does nothing. And I propose nothing changes because in order to fix something systemically wrong in our society, the powers that be have made it difficult, and it discouraged people to even speak up for themselves. For example, having to have 1,000 to 5,000 signatures on a petition in order to get a measure on the ballot, to me, is just suppression. They've made it so difficult, you almost need to have $1 million war chest to get an initiative on the ballot. Mm-hmm. So really, we have to change the recall laws. We have to change the laws on how we can petition our governments, mm-hmm. because they've made it so difficult for us to do. It's like it shouldn't be this difficult for citizens to enact change in a system that they clearly want change. Like, we don't want to stand in 4 to 5 hour voting lines, and it's apparent inequality in that structure. So we to move more towards a more equal voting system and better voting experience, you have to advocate for yourself. But once you go to advocate for yourself, you're up against a brick wall to get things even started. You know, so it's just an unfair system, and when you're dealing with an unfair system, even the fix is unfair.
It's more so since 2014, where the Princeton study determined that we're no longer a democracy operationally, where the percentage of people really grassroots level getting their needs and initiative met is like 0.08% of a chance, while the wealthy, which they identified as the oligarchy, have roughly a 63% chance of getting what they want made into actual laws. So that's a reality that people still aren't really hip to, because I think it's because of the ongoing propaganda, merely by people unintentionally or intentionally just saying that we are in a democracy. We are no longer in a democracy. So Citizens United, several acts that have taken place, even the Supreme Court doing things to suppress the black vote. These are things to further restrict people that traditionally vote or lean leftward politically to have less say and impact on a society, that through changing demographics and the economic sphere of the planet changing to center on BRICS nations, particularly China, the people at the top are harvesting or rearranging rules further to make things more difficult for the population to get their needs met, particularly the darker skin you are, the more ADOS you are, the less likely you're to have input or impact. And therefore the emphasis on us disproportionately, that we are the big people that make a change for democracy by our voting habits, which in some degree was true. But is it true right now when they're able to calcify wealth like they have? That they've been successful with Supreme Court decisions to suppress the vote, where both Democrats suppress our votes on primaries and Republicans suppress our votes during the open session. Right now, the biggest suppression of our votes is taking place now. There's no active power movement to change that. It has to come from the grassroots movements that attempt to change that, which they make it harder to do so.
Well, apparently people like the ACLU are supposed to be stepping in. There's civil rights lawyers, you know.
NAACP, they've been co-opted. They've been co-opted by the big money of corporations who have the same interests aligned with power, and those power interests are conservative white.
So really, the recourse that citizens have to even change the rules on how to change the laws in their
It's active protest. It's active protest. It means that you don't wait on a change law, that you confront the powers that be that are to enact laws. It's the same design that the people that went into the bus boycott movement, they didn't wait for the laws to change, although they did wait a long time for that. At some point, you reach the point, the misery index, where the point of waiting becomes so dangerous that people have to act, and they chose to act at that time. Right now, we're beginning to do so now.
How miserable is it to stand in a 4 to 5 hour voting line? You think you're a martyr? You think that you are doing your duty as a citizen, when in fact you are being suppressed, you are being disrespected and degraded in this system, when the exact same city and state, other people are having a better voting experience.
Yes.
So we should be marching to the Secretary of State and demanding a better voting experience. Instead, we're just putting up with it year after year, election after election, and no one, whether it's civil rights groups or is doing anything or having any effect in this regard. Lawsuits aren't working. They're getting dropped, or because judges that are put in place are meant to sabotage it.
The system is called systemic racism or institutional racist violence for a reason, for this very reason. Mm-hmm. And we have not been consistent. There's not been a consistent drumbeat of people being upset about that.
No, they just stand in the line.
And it's like lemmings. They're willing to do that. But again, the misery index, it doesn't just affect one area. So people are willing to tolerate it in that one area. It has to be multiple areas where people have a shared experience where they can then make it the correct interpretations. The challenge is when they're ready, when they're able, or when they're willing to make the correct interpretations, will there be talented enough people among that group to have effective change? or will it just go to barbarism? Rome went to barbarism eventually. Significant numbers of people just couldn't even write their own language. Only Christians could, and that's when Christianity started to take over here. So here we are at a level of misery where people don't even recognize that police officers should be professional when they interact with us, but it's become normalized that we got to be worried and concerned about them being brutal and aggressive because they started omitting education courses, particularly government courses, so that people were aware of that. So we got a generation later, 2 generations later, where it's just normalized that we've got to be on guard and confront of a police when it should be the other way around. That takes time. And again, the long lines, it was a rarity in 2000. What has happened? The racial demographics are shifting. Whites elites are more aware of their minority status, and they've done things through groups like ALEC and others to change local government to make things even easier for them. But what they've done is they placed Republican-leaning types in electoral management positions across the nation. And again, that's happened because we became complacent and lazy while our misery increases. And so they're making decisions and doing things so that we see a long line in Columbus. It was televised in 2000 and again in 2004. And it's expanded to Dayton, Ohio. It's expanded to other Ohio cities where you have concentrations of black folk. And that's to restrict our voting. It's another control of the traffic light system. It's to restrict our voting. It's to undermine our voting. It's to get people to move away. And it's happening more so now in poor white districts that it wasn't happening just 10 years ago. And so there's all these mechanisms in place. Well, just as there have been responses to police brutality of late, well, we're regularly protesting. We need to get actively protesting for those setups where both Democratic elites and Republican elites cooperate to suppress left-leaning majority cities. And that's what's happening now. We just haven't adequately responded to that yet, as we have responded to the police brutality one. And there's obvious reasons for that. We're not feeling the immediate pains of their restrictive capabilities to suppress our vote. We're just responding to them. Well, we're going to have to get to a point where the misery is so high that we will not just respond to them. We'll make demands on the system by protesting the fact that these agreements have gone down and the suppression is in full effect. We just have not responded adequately to that as yet.
Yeah, well, until we do, I guess we'll just stand in the lines and figure out how to change our policies and procedures that we do not agree with. We'll just figure that out on our own. This is just, a lot of times things change because honestly somebody died.
Yeah, sadly.
Violence or something. Somebody's going to have to, I don't want to say it.
Well,
somebody's going to have to be online and they lose their life.
We're already experiencing death as a result of the voter suppression. We're just not connecting the dots yet. When there's voter suppressions and the citizens don't get what their needs are, let's say it's health care, they don't get their needs met, well, people are dying as a result of that. It's just separated from the instance of voting or enacting rules. So there's this distance in it. Because that distance is there, people are not perceiving that, yeah, this is directly tied to not just getting your candidate in, but also getting adequate health care. And that your vote's not getting counted, even when you stand in those long lines. I mean, all that has been under attack because the people in power have adjusted the political spectrum rightward and therefore gotten people in position to do critical things that undermine our abilities to affect a voting outcome. And we have not adequately responded to that yet. And yeah, people are dying right now, and we're just not perceiving it because of the distance, observable distance that takes place between the issues of suppression voting and outcomes in terms of services. We're dying in the form of police because our votes have not been counted. We're dying in the form of inadequate health care. We're dying as a result of poor education that's impacting our young people disproportionately. They don't get adequate benefit from their education, and therefore are able to be the doctors and nurses and other things. I mean, all this is connected, and it's meant to have that effect.
I see.
And the same thing with charter schools and all that stuff is to undermine education, and it has an effect on life. But the public has to perceive it as such.
Hell in a handbasket. Hell in a handbasket. Please, at some point, speak up for yourself. All right, so that's it for this week's personality piece. Check back next week to see what we think about a thing or two.
Catch the fire. If you're ADOS, an ally, or friend, we encourage you to connect with a local ADOS chapter and help change your local politics. Our ADOS Ohio chapter in Columbus meets every fourth Sunday of the month. For more information on the time and location, visit adoscolumbus.org. You can also get more information on the ADOS movement, our politics, and the agenda. Please visit ados101.com.
Rapid news reports.
In today's Rapid News Reports, we have some articles that you may have missed, all in some way affect you and your ADOS life. Up first, we have
Diddy launches new political organization for black people called Our Black Party. From the publication Black Enterprise, author and writer Cedric Big Said Thornton. Months after suggesting that black people should hold their votes hostage in the 2020 election, Sean Diddy Combs is changing his tune. The hip-hop mogul announced that he is backing a new political organization that aims to center the voices of black Americans in politics and push a radically black agenda called Our Black Party. In an interview with media personality Charlamagne the God, Diddy admits to being irresponsible for telling black people to hold our vote hostage. In an earlier interview, a couple of months ago, I told everybody hold their vote hostage. Diddy said, "It would be irresponsible of me to have us hold our vote hostage, but it would also be irresponsible of me to just let this moment go by. The world is watching, and I'm doing everything I can to make sure that going forth, that we're a part of the narrative, that we own our politics." I graded this article unnecessary. Up next,
from the publication ABC News, entitled "Breonna Taylor is now attached to me for the rest of my life," Sergeant John Mattingly says in exclusive interview. Tagline: Taylor, 26, was shot by police in her Louisville, Kentucky apartment in March. Writer Bill Hutchinson. In an exclusive interview with ABC News, Mattingly, a 20-year veteran of the Louisville Metro Police Department, said one of the biggest things he would have done differently was to storm Taylor's residence without giving her time to answer what he claims were multiple knocks on her door, accompanied by repeated announcements of police search warrant. "We expected that Breonna was going to be there by herself. That's why we gave her so much time, and in my opinion, that was a mistake," Mattingly, 47, told Good Morning America co-anchor Michael Strahan in a wide-ranging 2-hour interview about the shooting that left him wounded, prompted nationwide protest, and led to demands that he and the other officers face homicide charges. What would I have done differently? The answer to that is simple, now that I've been thinking about it, Mattingly said. Number one, we would have either served the no-knock warrant, or we would have done the normal thing we do, which is 5 to 10 seconds, to not give people time to formulate a plan, not give people time to get their senses so they have an idea of what they're doing, because if that had happened, Breonna Taylor would be alive, 100%. I graded this interview poor. Post-interview, Strahan, Roberts, Stephanopoulos complained themselves how there were so many inconsistencies in the case. That was not addressed during the interview, which means ABC News and Strahan allowed their platform to be used so that Mattingly could white-splain his view of events unimpeded. As far as Mattingly claiming this case was not exactly like George Floyd or Ahmaud Arbery's, he's correct. It isn't exactly like those cases. It was merely a variation on the same theme. That's the problem and why people are protesting. Don't waste your time with this. And next?
To understand why some black men support Trump, start with Ice Cube. From the publication LA Times, author and writer Erica D. Smith. For weeks, I've been trying to figure out why polls keep showing that a small yet still politically significant number of black men are likely to vote for President Trump. Then along came Ice Cube and his contract with Black America, and suddenly it's all a little clearer. For those who've been keeping up, the Los Angeles rapper, who by his own admission only started paying attention to politics this year, has admitted to working with the Trump administration, basically agreeing to act as an independent advisor on behalf of all black people. For the record, as a black person, I did not agree to this. That Ice Cube felt justified in putting himself out there in this way is pure hubris. In ordering up his contract with Black America over the summer, he did so without first consulting with many of the Black activists who have crafted similar plans and are in the process of implementing them with elected officials. But what's truly telling is his explanation for why he has been shopping around his plan to Republicans and Democrats mere weeks before the most contentious U.S. election in modern history, and why he's upset that in the midst of all this, Democrats understandably blew him off. I graded this week. Ice Cube had the audacity to not play along with usual politics, that the sassy blue checks, gatekeepers, and Democratic fanatics can always see the failures of Republicans, but can't seem to find any fault in the benevolent, never wrong Democrats. Or maybe they do, and turn a blind eye in order to avoid voting for the devil, only to vote for Satan. And up next,
from the publication Breitbart, entitled Joe Biden Admits 1994 Crime Bill Was a Mistake During Town Hall. Written by Hannah Blue. Democrat presidential hopeful Joe Biden admitted that his 1994 crime bill was a mistake during a televised town hall on Thursday. The former vice president added that he would, as president, organize a national study group comprised of cops, social workers, and Black and brown community members in the hopes that they come up with significant reforms that need to take place within communities. I graded this report poor. An example of Biden's leadership proposing another study on things that have already been studied. Based on policy Biden has been begged to legislate since the early 2000s. Don't waste your time with this. And next,
a lesson from the Million Man March. From the publication Final Call, author and writer Nabaya Muhammad. The Million Man March, October 16, 1995, was a day of great joy and a major victory in a world where Black men are denigrated, rejected, targeted, hated, and stereotyped. We live in the world of an enemy who has made us enemies to ourselves and to one another, with us not knowing Satan throws a rock and hides his hands, creates circumstances to keep us perpetually in crisis, and teaches us to hate ourselves. But on that marvelous Monday, 25 years ago, there was a new, different, and divine image of Black men. Men embraced. Men wept. When men who needed to get off the packed National Mall to get to a restroom, their brothers lifted them and handed them over, one to another, to find relief. I graded this article good. Up next.
And I was one among the 1 million.
Oh, really?
From the publication Associated Press, entitled Honor the Ancestors, Harris Appeals Directly to Black Men. Written by Bill Barrow. I'm not going to tell anybody, including Black men, that they're supposed to vote for us. We need to earn that vote, Harris told a roundtable of Black men in one of several stops across Atlanta, the Democratic base of Georgia, an emerging battleground state. Yes, I decided to go up the rough side of the mountain, as we say in church. Harris told him, I'm sorry. I was able to be professional the first time he did that, but I'm sorry. That was you look like you just got stung by a bee or something.
Come on, pander.
I know, it's sad. Okay. Here. Yes, I decided to go up the rough side of the mountain, as we say in church, Harris told him, framing her career choice as a conscious decision to change a flawed system from within. She rattled off several efforts, describing a reentry program that she said steered young men arrested or convicted of nonviolent drug offenses into jobs. They referred to my program as a hug a thug program, she said. Harris acknowledged she didn't change the whole system, but pushed back on the criticism. It suggests Black people shouldn't be prosecutors. It suggests that you don't love your community, or you don't want to reform the system if you decide to go in it. I graded this story poor. Harris claimed that Trump was misrepresenting her record without saying how. She claimed her intent of being a prosecutor was to change a flawed system. The article only mentions one attempt, a reentry program that she couldn't claim was a success. Then she admitted that she was not successful in reforming the system, with several cases such as the Matrice Richardson case. black indentured firefighters, black men on death row whose evidence she refused to review, putting black women in prison for their children's school truancy, protecting cops from investigations. With all this, Ms. Harris was a total and purposeful failure at reforming the system from within. In fact, those ancestors she called upon to honor must have been the high caste, almost white Brahmin ancestors she must have been referring to. Don't waste your time with this. And next,
the missing black voters. African Americans who sat out 2016 explain why they're voting this year. From the publication The Washington Post, author and writer, Washington Post staff. After Donald Trump won in 2016, anguished Democrats wondered how they could recapture the white voters in the Midwest who swung heavily to his campaign, turning states that had long been safely blue into red on electoral maps. But this fall's election might hinge on a different demographic, one that was overshadowed by the focus on working class whites, black voters who sat out 2016. Black turnout declined in 2016 for the first time in 20 years, falling from 66.2% of eligible voters in 2012, a higher share than for white eligible voters in that election, to 59.6%. Black voters overwhelmingly backed Joe Biden. Washington Post ABC News national polls conducted last month and earlier this month found Biden leading Trump among African American likely voters 92% to 8%. So if black voters who stayed home 4 years ago turn out this year, Biden could swing back the states that Trump narrowly won against Hillary Clinton, no matter what happens with the white vote. I graded this article good. I still don't see where we sway elections, but everyone seems to think so, so I'm willing to be open-minded about it. If you feel your vote selects presidents for the sake of your blue pill mind and to avoid your head exploding, I hope that it does. I really hope that you get the president that you voted for. And up next,
from the publication Politico, entitled, Biden Says His and Obama's Immigration Record Was a Mistake. Tagline, the former vice president also condemned the Trump administration for separating migrant families at the border. This is written by Matthew Choi. Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden said he and former President Barack Obama made a mistake because they did not achieve comprehensive immigration reform during their administration. The remark came after President Donald Trump on Thursday night defended his administration's policy of separating families at the border, a move that has been deeply criticized and was reversed in 2018. The parents of more than 500 children separated under that policy cannot be found. During the debate, however, Trump went after Biden and Obama for creating detention facilities for undocumented immigrants in the first place. Who made the cages, Joe? Trump said. I graded this story fair. Good that the article quotes Trump in order to mention a fact, that the cages belong to the Obama administration. Poor that the article failed to mention that a tactic of American policy has usually been to inflict hell on immigrants, especially non-white immigrants, in order to deter the flow of those immigrants willing to come here. No one need look no further than the Clinton administration, who treated Haitians horribly in American detention centers, only to return them to Haiti, to be tortured and or forced to work in one of the many exploitative ventures in Haiti supported by the Clinton Foundation. And next,
Ice Cube, a contract with Black America. Our ancestors are finally proud. Hashtag ADOS. From the publication Medium.com, author and writer Charlie Peach. This is not one of my normal blogs, but more of a caption of various stories that were written by me in various media outlets. I have compiled these stories, videos, and clips to show the outright lies and hypocrisy of the Democratic machine and its paid black celebrity gatekeepers who have been sent out en masse to silence and corral any black dissension or thought. Over the last several days, there has been a cacophony of noise sent out to silence the voice of Ice Cube for daring to stand alone against the Democratic machine and its sold-out black celebrities and black media mouthpieces. There has been a loud noise of black women feminists crying foul that black men would somehow dare not vote for Joe Biden, the author of the 1994 crime bill that led to mass incarceration. These women are leading a charge to berate black men for not getting on code. They are complaining about the percentage of black men who voted for Trump in 2016 and how that number may grow this election. None of these black women have ever uttered that many black men are not eligible to vote because of Joe Biden and Democrats' crime bill and other incentives that he himself put into place to ensure that black men were permanent underclass. I graded this article good. The article touched on the gender divide that was non-existent in Ice Cube's contract, as he addressed the entire black family structure, which includes black women. Could this be a result of black women not seeing themselves as having families, that if they don't have specific language for them, that they feel left out? Possibly. But our movement does not divide us based upon gender or sexuality. So they don't know enough to understand and recognize themselves in a family or lineage. Catch up, ladies. You are already in Ice Cube's plans. You just don't recognize it. And up next,
from the publication NPR, entitled The Unlikely Story Behind Japanese Americans' Campaign for Reparations, written by Isabella Rosario. John Takehishi, now 81, was incarcerated at the Manzanar internment camp in California from ages 3 to 6. After the war ended, Takehishi and his family returned to Los Angeles, where Takehishi says they tried their best to assimilate. Decades later, in 1975, he and his wife, Carol, became founding members of the local Japanese American Citizens League, GeAzan. As the civil rights organization's national redress director, Takehishi helped to lead the eventually successful fight for reparations. The conflict most often occurred between generations: the Nisei generation, who were born between 1910 and 1930 to immigrant parents, and the Sensei, who were either incarcerated at very young age or born after the war. To process the trauma of the camps, Takehishi writes, the Nisei generation embraced traditional values that encouraged them to put the past behind them. For example, gaman means to endure or preserve with dignity, and shikotagani translates to it can't be undone or it can't be helped. Their careers and businesses were most upended by internment. Takehishi says, but they were not interested in focusing the GeAzan's efforts on the government handout of reparations. But their children, the Sensei generation, grew up in the shadow of the civil rights movement. They came to see the internment camps as another form of racial oppression that needed to be spoken out against. But by 1978, the GeAzan's redress campaign was officially launched, even as intergenerational disputes persisted. Ultimately, the GeAzan and the Japanese American community as a whole came together over a collective obligation to uphold American ideas, Takehishi writes. And finally, in 1988, a decade after the campaign began and over 40 years after the internment camps closed, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, which offered a formal apology and paid $20,000 to each survivor. I graded this account good. And that's it for this week's Rapid News. All articles featured will be posted in our Facebook group and in the show notes on our website. Are you busy? Is the news coming so fast you can barely keep up? No worries. The Articles of ADOS podcast is here to help. Hit the subscribe button wherever you're listening right now, and we'll make sure you stay up to date on the news and information that affects you and your ADOS life.
Time now for the main event.
In this week's main event, we will present the article, The Complicated Role of Black Leaders in Shaping the Criminal Justice System, from the publication NPR. Author and writer Gene Demby. We both will ask questions and give answers in this presentation. Thank you, Mr. Demby. To begin, let's frame our discussion. You had previously did a podcast that discussed Kamala Harris' career and how it affected Black people.
Yes, we dove into Kamala Harris's past as a prosecutor, both as the district attorney of San Francisco and attorney general of California. It's a history that she has touted on the campaign trail, but it's also earned her flack from those who criticize what they see as a harsh and unyielding approach to prosecuting and incarcerating people, especially black people, without due consideration of the ways the system discriminates against those defendants.
She essentially became the poster child of the crime bill, did she not?
Harris's history as a prosecutor and politician is inseparable from the moment she began her career, the epoch of Bill Clinton's crime bill and the end of the crack epidemic era. And in those days, she was one of many black lawyers, judges, police officers, and legislators who took a similar approach to the problems they saw affecting their community.
Essentially, black politicians and professionals profited and enhanced their own careers off the backs of other black people in their community?
Correct, which is why we wanted to talk with James Forman Jr., a professor at Yale Law School and author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Lock Up Our Own: Crime and Punishment in Black America, to help us understand the complicated interplay between black leaders and the criminal justice system, which has disproportionately targeted and incarcerated black folks. Only part of what he told us made it into the final cut of the episode. So here's an extended cut of our conversation, which has been edited and condensed for clarity.
Okay, so what I will do is let you read your own words, and I will read the professor's response, and when we come back, we can address any questions that may arise. Sound good?
Sounds great.
Okay, listeners, stay tuned as you get a chance to hear this very important conversation with James Forman Jr.
You spent the early part of your career as a public defender in Washington, D.C., which at the time was one of the most violent cities in the United States. It was also one of the blackest cities in the country. You often found yourself defending your black clients against black prosecutors, and you were standing before black judges. Can you tell us about your client, Brandon, and how his sentencing changed the way you thought about the role of black people played in the great apparatus of criminal punishment? Note, Brandon is not his real name.
Brandon was a teenage client of mine who was faced with possession of marijuana and possession of gun charges, and we were at sentencing. So the judge had to decide what he was going to do because Brandon had pled guilty, and I was arguing that Brandon should be on probation. I had a letter from a teacher and a counselor at his school. It was his first arrest. Brandon's mom and grandmother were in court. They wanted him to come home. But the prosecutor in the case wanted him to be locked up and go to Oak Hill, which was the name of the juvenile prison back then. It was a place where young people always left worse off when they entered. And the judge had to make the decision in the case. He had a young black man facing sentencing. He had me, a black public defender, and a black prosecutor. The judge himself was African American. And he looks at Brandon and he said, "Son, Mr. Foreman's been telling me that you've had a tough life, that you deserve a second chance. Well, let me tell you about tough. Let me tell you about Jim Crow segregation." The judge, who had been a child in those years, proceeded to lecture Brandon on what it meant to live under Jim Crow. He said, "People marched, people died for your freedom. Dr. King died for you, and he didn't die for you to be running and gunning and carrying on, embarrassing your family and community. So I hope Mr. Foreman is right. I hope one day you turn it around. But today in this courtroom, actions have consequences." So he locked Brandon up. What you have to understand is that I had taken the job of being a public defender because I thought I was living out the generational struggle for civil rights that those heroes like Dr. King had fought for. I viewed, and still view to this day, mass incarceration as the civil rights struggle of my generation. And here we have a judge who's invoking Dr. King, the same hero who motivates me to be a public defender, in this twisted moral logic for why Brandon should be locked up. The judge was not the only black person in the system. We had a majority black police force. We had a black mayor. The chief prosecutor in the city at the time was Eric Holder. We had a majority black city council. And we were doing in our majority black community what much of the country was doing in these years. We were doing stop and frisk. We were passing mandatory minimums. We were making the sentences longer and longer for drug and other crimes. It really caused me to sit back and ask this question. How did this come to be in a black city with black leadership?
Your book is about this overlooked role that black folks, whether they're public officials or private citizens, played in expanding the carceral state in the United States. So what part did they play?
I should just say up front that by focusing on the role that African Americans played, I'm by no means saying that black people were the only or even the main drivers of this, but I really wanted to explore the role that black people played because I'm ultimately interested in black intellectual, political, civic, and cultural history, and I wanted to solve the paradox of Brandon's case. But by no means do I minimize the role that racism and other forces played in creating this system. The fear and the anger that was present in so many communities was palpable. When you went to community meetings back in the 80s and 90s and people were talking about what they wanted, you would hear a lot of, "We want more police officers, and we want police officers to be more aggressive." Citizens were afraid. Surveys that were done back in those decades show that black people had greater rates of fear of crime and fear of violence. Some of those legislators, prosecutors, and police officers that I'm talking about took those jobs because they viewed themselves as fighting for and protecting the black community. But what I think is really crucial to understand is that when black people went to community meetings and said we want more police, it wasn't the only thing they were asking for. They also wanted more money for jobs, drug treatment, mental health treatment. They wanted real gun control. They asked for a Marshall Plan for urban America. And of all the things that black people asked for back in that period of time, they got the law and order part. They got the police and prosecutors and prisons.
Why didn't they get the other things they asked for?
I mean, the short and the simple answer is racism, right? The more complicated answer is that black political power has always been concentrated locally. It's been concentrated at the city level, at the police chief level, at the mayoral level, at the city council level. But to get the Marshall Plan, to get that kind of funding, local government wasn't enough. You needed state governments, and crucially, you needed Congress. From there, you get the story of black political figures going and asking for that greater funding. But because of indifference to the plight of the black community throughout the rest of America, because of racism, those claims went unheard. And so the thing that they got was the thing that the larger political culture was already interested in offering.
Which was more incarceration.
Right.
But even at the time when you saw this, while there were black people who were really vocal about being tough on crime, there were always other voices in those communities who were pushing back on this idea, who said that locking people up would be harmful, right?
I'm really glad you asked that question because whenever you write history, at some level the winners get more focus on the page. It certainly is true that at every step of the way there's opposition. All of these choices were contested. There were a lot of us public defenders in the 90s and a lot of us black people saying, wait a minute, mass incarceration is our civil rights struggle. This is a mistake. At every community meeting, there were multiple sides of the issue that were being presented.
You introduced this really interesting notion that we have this criminal justice system that isn't nearly as cohesive as people think it is. That for all intents and purposes, it's a non-system made up of a bunch of semi-independent parts interacting with each other. How did we end up here?
Part of it is that nobody by themselves ever had an up or down vote on, hey, should we create the largest prison system in the history of the world? It wasn't presented to people in that way. It was presented as, should there be more police officers responding to complaints about teenagers playing loud music or somebody selling drugs? And then in the prosecutor's office, there are decisions to bring more cases and to give fewer plea offers and to push for longer sentences. And then the judges are all themselves getting somewhat harsher. And then the legislatures are passing laws to give judges longer sentences that they can impose, or in some cases, with mandatory minimums must impose. Parole boards, for their part, are getting tougher and tougher. So if everybody in the non-system in their own roles gets 5%, 10%, 20% tougher, nobody by themselves has to say, let's create the world's largest gulag. But that's the end result. Because everybody is pushing in the same direction. You could think of it as almost like a conveyor belt or an assembly line. If everybody speeds up their piece of it all at the same time and sustains that over decades, then things get ramped up to the speed that we have now. We get the inhumanity and the brutality that so many people today are commenting on and wondering, what do we do about it? And that's the last piece of it, because it's touched so many small parts of the system where everybody is going in the same direction. A lot of people say to me, well, what's the most important thing? Was it mandatory minimums? Was it the war on drugs? Was it felony disenfranchisement? And what I always try to say in response is that no one of these single things by itself is responsible. And that's why we have a pushback on all of them at the same time.
But the problem of mass incarceration, even though it disproportionately affects Black Americans, is not landing on all of us to the same degree and with the same weight. How does class play out in who was advocating for tough on crime policies and who was on the receiving end of those policies?
The question of class and socioeconomic status can often be overlooked because it gets presented as alongside race. There aren't that many sociologists or other people who have really looked at the question of class within the African American community and asked, well, how does that impact politics? And I think the story of mass incarceration is that not all segments of Black community have been hit equally hard. That is to say, for African Americans who have gone to college, the risk of going to prison in your lifetime has not increased. The real increase has been hyper concentrated on African Americans who have not graduated from high school. It's also important to recognize that people are a part of families and people are a part of communities. So there is a kind of empathy because for a lot of Black people who went to college or went to professional school, we may have somebody or in our family who has suffered and did graduate high school or barely graduated high school and has been arrested and been convicted. I don't want to suggest for a second that a Black person who graduated from college is in the same position as a white person who graduated from college in relation to the risk of going to prison. That is not true. But here we're talking about how within the Black community we do see this class and educational divide. And that ends up being so important because who are the people that are actually making the decisions? Who are the prosecutors? Who are the judges? Who's voting at the city council? These are folks that almost by definition right in the Black elite. They may not all have been born into the Black elite, but they've now made it, and they are now in a position of being able to make decisions and pass laws. One of the reasons why people find the story of Brandon somewhat surprising is that there's an assumption that we make. Well, everybody in the courtroom was Black, so shouldn't the judge understand where Brandon was coming from? But if you think about it from Brandon's perspective, he may have looked at himself as alone in the courtroom. Yes, we were all Black, but all the rest of us were professionals, even me, his lawyer. The prosecutor was a lawyer. The judge was a lawyer. So Brandon may have been actually aware of these class differences that get somewhat lost in our conversation because we can sometimes. It's just easy to miss because skin color is so salient in the way we understand the world. I will say this was powerful information. Just powerful. The system will change you before it lets you change it. Are there any questions that we need to address?
I don't believe so. What we presented speaks for itself.
All right, well, that completes this presentation. Listeners, you can get the link to this full article on our website in this week's show notes. Coming up, we have the commentary on this article. Did we like it? Did we hate it? Stay tuned. We want to take the time to give our friends and listeners a shout out. Thank you for clicking that subscribe button and for liking and sharing the podcast. You can also continue supporting the show by joining our Patreon, where you can receive exclusive content and promotional items for as little as $3 a month. Sponsoring the show will ensure that we can continue to bring you the news and information important to your ADOS life. So head on over and join us at patreon.com/articles of ADOS.
We'd like to take the time to give recognition to Bomani Moyinda for becoming a Patreon of our Articles of ADOS podcast. Really appreciate it, brother.
Yes, and you too can become our Patreon if you go to patreon.com/articles of ADOS and contribute monthly to our great program. So, what do we think of this article?
I like it. It gave a detailed rationalization for how Black people on the whole who were able to be a part of the professional class were effectively co-opted. There's not a nice way to put it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like the article. It kind of began with Kamala Harris and her record as a Black district attorney and then attorney general in California, and really through her campaign for president and now vice president, A lot of the blue checks and dim voters kind of make an excuse for her on that she was basically doing her job. And what he described in this article, black people were basically doing the jobs that they either were elected for or hired to do. They went along with what, and I kind of alluded to at the end, that you can't change the system even if you're in it. A lot of these lawyers and prosecutors and judges and police officers, whether you're black or not, you're really not changing the system that you're in. And you presented an article in Rapid News where Kamala Harris effectively failed at changing the system that she wanted to do. So their aspiration is good. Yeah, they want to get in and change these systems, but they're not. They're perpetuating this train that's on the track, and you really can't stop it. He also alluded to that everybody is playing a part of being tough on crime. So if the judge is being tough on sentencing, and then the prosecutor is being tough on bringing more charges, and then once you're incarcerated, then you're getting tough on tougher sentences, and you're in jail longer, and so then the parole board is tougher too. So they're not granting probation as much as they used to. So everybody in the system is being tough on crime, really to gain political points and to impart the racism that is in our system. So everybody's loaded up on this mass incarceration train, and nobody can stop it. So I thought the article was good. He made some great points.
Yeah, the idea that it gives was a very good detailed analysis of the step-by-step refinement that resulted in black people cooperating in our own oppression. And there's all kinds of ways I could go at this, but one of the easiest ways to kind of understand it in terms of the awareness that people that can have now is the experience of Michelle Alexander, the author of The New Jim Crow. Like myself in the 80s, she ran into these so-called radical blacks who would leave leaflets, as I recall her describing on one occasion, where it said, the justice system is about just us being incarcerated, words to that effect. And she thought how kind of wild that was, and out of the out of the norm that was, because she was plugged into the legitimacy of the system and how it operated. Today we call that black respectability politics. Then it was just, you're fitting in. We fought the civil rights movement, and we've gained access, and our goal is to make the system work better for us. And a lot of us entered sincerely believing that, but doing good at our jobs also meant cooperating with the system that would also attack you if you stayed away from it. Well, she dives into the data. She realizes that these people on the margins are describing their lived experience, while people within the system just know how well the game is played so they can have individual merit and benefit. But at the same time, resulting in those negative outcomes for the black community. Well, after she did the exposure to the analysis, she realized they weren't crazy. They weren't exaggerating. They weren't being hyperbolic. In fact, that's the way it worked when you look beyond the experience of the incarcerated and realize that once they're free, a lot of the reason why recidivism is high is because there is now an excuse for continued Jim Crow segregation on them. And now it's just the idea of felony held over their head. And she says, oh my God, it is the same dynamic. That means Jim Crow really didn't get destroyed. It merely, and these are my terms, mutated. It mutated to adjust to the environmental demands that was placed on it by the civil rights movement. And that's all that happened. So we end up cooperating with a nuanced system that wanted to have the same outcomes: punish black life and reward white life. There was a white individual in Florida, can't remember his name, I apologize, but he had as many as 250 felonies, and he was free when he committed this crime. Now, how is he able to have 250 felonies and he's not locked up somewhere? Because among whites, And within white dominated structures, they have more flexibility to utilize the law in a way that is not as repressive or restrictive as it is towards black people. When black people are operating in it, they're doing good at just doing good at their jobs, which they won't be willing to do with Brandon. And they're just following the rules. They're just following the law, where white people have more flexibility in adhering to the law or applying it or not. And they are not judged. Matter of fact, they're given a pat on the back because they gave the young man a chance after he's, even possibly even killed somebody. So we have to acknowledge that that's been going on. And just like we said in our discussion period, in our personality piece, the reality is that blacks don't have that flexibility. And so all too often, the outcome is going to be a negative outcome for us, as we're just following the rules. And why? Because if we go beyond that as black people within that system, we will be singled out. There's already analysis of black people, particularly black men, who are intelligent on their jobs, but people focus upon them as being a problem because they will seek out flexibility that their coworkers won't seek out, and therefore they'll be dealt with in some sort of way. If you had a prosecutor that was really being what Kamala Harris claims she was doing, then she would not have made where she would not have attained what she'd made had she done so. If she not protected police, and instead of come down hard on them, they would have found a way to attack her. She survived and got to where she got because she was compliant to the expectations, while she can proclaim professionalism. While on the campaign trail, she claims that she was being aggressively out for the needs and interests of black folks. When you look at her record, that can't possibly be true. And that's a reality we, sadly, too many of us have not adequately dealt with.
Yeah, I think we lied to ourselves that having black faces in these positions would have a different outcome. I'm not expecting them to not do their job, but your job is to lock black people up. So tell the truth.
Yeah.
Don't lie on campaign trails, or when you're running for a position, or when you're running for another elected office, that you want to paint your career as something that it wasn't.
Yeah.
And so I just think we lie to ourselves when we get black faces in these positions where you think you don't want special peripheral treatment.
Yes, you do. I'm sorry.
Well, I don't.
And
if I did wrong,
Yeah,
but I don't expect them. But if
whites get that commonly, whites get the second-hand treatment. They get the back door. They don't get the heavy, aggressive, aggravated murder charge. They just get the murder
that's what
charge.
I'm saying. I would prefer equality, equal justice in these positions. If you're gonna be a black prosecutor, you giving Brad 1 year and you giving Tyrone 10 years. That's unequal justice. Mm-hmm. Everybody in this system has discretion, from the judge all the way to the prosecutor to the parole. Mm-hmm. Nobody has got their hands tied behind their back. To a certain extent, I understand they have now mandatory minimums because of the crime bill. Mm-hmm. But even then, even in your mandatory minimums, you're giving Tyrone 15 years and you're giving Brad 10. If the mandatory minimum is like what's the lady that shot Botham John? If the mandatory minimum is 10 years, you're giving them 10 years instead of where you're giving black people 20 years. You see what I'm saying? So it's unequal justice, and all we want is equal justice. But I understand it's hard to ask for that in a systemically racist system.
There you go. And when you say systemically racist and say all we want is justice, the reality is we're not going to get it unless we fight for it. And the problem is we have not been consistently fighting for it because we spent a long amount of time trying to fit into it and change it from within. And some of us in the 70s to 80s went in there sincerely to do that. But we were weeded out. We were singled out and persecuted. We know that black faces in high places, if they were doing things for us, were disproportionately investigated, disproportionately charged with crimes, and got out of there. So that taught a lesson by the 1990s and into the 2000s. We need to go along to get along so I can gain prestige in my individual growth and basis and therefore become a Kamala Harris.
What do you say to somebody in these positions?
It's more than just being blackface in a high place. We got to demand results. And then when they get under attack, we've got to support them. That's been the problem.
Accountability.
We got to support them for making those decisions that will be beneficial to our community. When they don't do so, we should drum them out and not just be happy that they're a black face in a high place. And also, when they become under attack for advocating for us, we've got to be there for them. And that's where we haven't been there for them. And therefore, there's been no incentive to do right by us when they're the black face in the high place.
All right. Well, that's it for this week's commentary on our main event. Check back next week for a great new interview or presentation on an article that you may have missed. In this week's Voices of ADOS, we want to feature our very own Daud GeAzan. On October 17, 2020, Daud presented his case of reparations to Yellow Springs Speaking Up for Justice group out of Yellow Springs, Ohio. And in its entirety, we're going to let him read his own words.
On October 17th, 2020, I was approached by Bumani Moyinda, a listener of Articles of ADOS, who loves our work and asked me to present the case for reparations to his group in Yellow Springs, Ohio, called Yellow Springs Speaking Up for Justice. And this was the speech I presented at that gathering. The case for reparations. I greet you in love, through a desire for freedom, through a quest for justice that should result in peace. If it doesn't, do it again till you get it right. I salute the superhumans. Bomani Moyinda, I've admired since we worked together on a publication called Nia back in the 1990s. I admired him more as he took on the John Crawford III issue, while I was too busy on a hamster wheel. He would later rescue me as I fell from the hamster wheel, ending up in a homeless shelter by asking me if I wanted to be involved with writing for the Writing While Black blog instead of giving me money. Planning on my next article kept my brain alive while I and others cohabitated in what a land of giving up looked like. Thank you, Bumani. When I was approached by the ADOS movement to be their opposition research and news and information director, yeah, if the establishment does to the ADOS movement as it has tried to do and has done to previous movements before ours, then at least I'll have a fancy title. While Bumani celebrated this as though I'd won the Nobel Peace Prize, then after I was asked to be a co-host to the Articles of ADOS podcast, he listened to a few of my rants and he wrote me and said, I admire your energy, intellect, and focus. Well, my rescuer had made me feel complete. Bumani is my superhuman. Thank you, Bumani. To my superhumans, Kevin and Brittany, two white allies of the ADOS movement, they saved me from having to live in a shelter. In addition, they most likely saved my life, given that the previous year I had pneumonia again. The first time I got it 30 years ago, it nearly took my life. I met Kevin at a spiritual men's group, so he and Brittany asked me to move in. Yeah, I gave them the warning about me and my personality. Well, despite this, they took me in. Well, COVID hit, and with my previous bouts with pneumonia that left my lungs scarred, it has really been good that I was not in a shelter as COVID was emerging. I owe them my life, of which I plan on repaying them, even though they've refused. They just said they just will expect a big discount when reparations gets to be paid to Black Americans. To the Yellow Springs community, a community I visited many times since childhood. It was here my father and I would trek down the road from Springfield since I was 5 for my piano lessons with my aunt, Anna G. Blackwell. She was my superhuman, and I miss her greatly. To the Yellow Springs and all those whom I stood with over a decade ago in the fight to free Mumia Abu Jamal, to the people I see here now, you were not supposed to be here doing what you all are doing. All the hippie jokes and media bombardments on how ungrateful and un-American 1960s movements were by generating dissent. As such, human movements hoped that man would learn war no more. Those merchants of death have planned to discourage that generation. Through COINTELPRO, it attempted to wipe out from the minds of humanity with humane values, even the desire to seek needs or stands for justice. The very stands you all are making today. This is why, Yellow Springs people, you are my superhumans, and I salute you. Now an introduction, finally. To assert the case for reparations, I must lift the curtain I begin my remarks with by remarking that a lot of what I'm about to say to you is going to upset you. It's not going to be accepted well. It's going to make people feel a little uncomfortable, perhaps even a bit angry. So much so it will be unlikely that I will ever be invited to speak before you all again. Because in order for the case for reparations to effectively be made, some recent social behavioral constructions have to be minimized or outright dismantled. Since so much of the population has been conditioned to accept many of these not entirely accurate socio-behavioral constructions as valid, many are emotionally attached to them. Many have even erected what appears to them to be rational arguments in support of these not entirely accurate socio-behavioral constructions. So I will address them here. It's going to be a little ruffling of feathers. This is because we exist no longer in a representative democracy. No matter how many times people continue to state this, we in fact exist in effective and operational oligarchy with fascistic tendencies, which smacks of a great deal of corruption on multiple levels that have been developing for a long period of time, thus cementing in the minds of many of the American public, now for generations, culminating into inaccurate social behavioral constructions that many Americans will simply refuse to let go of. This is why we find ourselves with full-fledged Trump supporters. This is why we find ourselves surrounded by people who don't know that Barack Obama was a more effective evil, displaying white domination racism and by and large considered a very good president. These seemingly opposing and well-acknowledged social behavioral constructions are deeply entrenched. Asserting the case for reparations is insulting. The social behavioral constructions have been many and vast, birthed by the offshoots of COINTELPRO. For years, so sophisticated, they are not even sophisticated anymore. Allow me to give you an easy one. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, by the 1980s, when he received a national holiday for establishment regurgitation conventional wisdom purposes, about him was his famous I Have a Dream speech. By the 1990s, he was reduced further from the speech to the sentence, I have a dream. Then by the 2000s, he was known for the dream. Many of you more astute people of the audience have heard this before, right? Yet believe it or not, many people over the years I've said these very words to got upset because the symbolism of MLK's dream and what it potentially provided meant and means a lot to people, who would become upset as though I was cursing at them for pointing this out. Then to be blown away by an even greater truth, which even ended some friendships I had. With all that limitation of MLK, you have also been trapped into the time vortex of 1963, as though he did not exist beyond the March on Washington. The public wasn't conditioned to be versed in the MLK of 1967 and his Vietnam War speech, as well as his Poor People's Campaign and its plan to politically unite the oppressed classes, which was the rationalization given for his assassination by agents of the U.S. government, along with American and international mafia, Central Intelligence, military intelligence, as well as the Ku Klux Klan, had their sights on him April 4th, that horrible day. Thus the need for the social behavioral constructions of 1963 time vortex. Well, chief among the oppressed, he noted, were the American descendants of slavery, a term he coined, along with a very important phrase, not symbolic like a dream, but tangible and economically integrative into American society, which had not been ventured in his and the movement's previous efforts accepted by the establishment ultimately. Where he stated in his plans to motivate enthusiasm for the Poor People's Campaign, he said, "We're coming to get our check." His incompleted efforts, in fact, laid the foundation of today's ADOS lineage movement, reestablished by attorney Antonio Moore and political strategist Yvette Carnell just 3 short years ago, where last year presidential candidates were forced to respond to our call, thus the case for reparations. Reparations to and for the American descendants of slavery is a debt that is owed. Thank you. I hope you invite me back. Okay. I'll give you a more thorough walk through the woods. The fact that at this stage, a case for reparation is insulting. After a variety of groups have been wrong, sometimes too long and others right on time, have been duly repaired or compensated makes reparations for American descendants of slavery such a no-brainer. It's insulting. This cataclysmic debacle could only exist for mass social behavioral constructed conditioning. The particulars, to name a few, are: former American enslavers were provided reparations. With the cost of the Civil War, in addition to their property no longer their own, most slave owners and those who indirectly benefited from the practice were largely repaired by the 1920s. Incoming European immigrants were repaired. Though they had not been damaged by this government or nation, they received the Homestead Land Grant Acts and other preferential treatment, allowing them to become economically stable, with many becoming economically self-sufficient to wealth, perpetuating a now old social behavioral construction of how all they got, they worked hard for. Read works like recent articles like The Great White Heist by Michael Harriot in the Black Agenda Report. Details the outright theft of Black ownership of educational opportunity from Black Americans. Why wasn't this taught to us in our schools? You know why. During the post-Civil War period to roughly 1910, social mobility moved at a rate of nearly 30%. Today's slogans about working hard, playing by the rules, and you'll be successful came from this period, stated loud and strong even through Reaganomics, even as social mobility was a mere 3%, up until what I refer to as the white elite predator class robbery of the U.S. Treasury in 2008, which the American population has been socio-behaviorally conditioned to call the Great Recession. Reparations is owed because enslaved Africans built the fortunes of the wealthiest nation in the Earth's history. Like most treaties regarding the U.S. actions towards the government's wards, the indigenous peoples, steps towards paying this debt to the formerly enslaved and now their descendants have been effectively thwarted until now. Except for the continuing playbook of COINTELPRO and social behavioral constructed thinking. Media organizations like MSNBC was set up by conservative executives empowered by the Clinton-era media policies, which permitted the white elite predator class to consolidate media ownership and power, with a goal of capturing progressive hippie types in order to undermine effective grassroots thought. Fox News merely concentrated primarily on baby boomer whites to cement their thought. They got the money, so in many degrees, other news services have been imitating them. Evidence for all this: we are still in Afghanistan and we are still in Iraq. They just don't call it a war, so we don't get the coverage of the carnage we are still unleashing on Iraqi citizens. So as the ADOS lineage movement was gaining mention in national circles, Joy Reid was socio-behaviorally conditioning her viewers to see that anyone online proclaiming ADOS on issues such as reparations was a Russian bot. To the baby boomers involved in the Pan-Africanism and a series of reparations movements, I love them. I donated to them for several years. Yet there is evidence that Conyers' bill was programmed to be a payoff measure to designated baby boomers because they had acknowledged America's unwillingness to actually pay the debt that is owed. Yet positions could be gleaned from merely the study of reparations for decades. At least so they must have reasoned, given that they were so complacently in the pockets of the Democratic Party who refused to pay them, that they only established online presence last year. Now, if you want a case for reparations, that case is how it would be of benefit to all Americans and even the earth, because the ADOS lineage movement is calling a change in the system that picks winners and losers. We are calling for a restructuring of American capitalism that will make ADOS owners of capital instead of perpetual servants to capital. As the policy of affirmative action slowly morphed into a government program which mainly benefits white women and thus white families, it is very likely that the restructuring of the economy the ADOS movement is calling for will also benefit other Americans in the same way, providing us with the ability to strive for a new American equitable and tangible dream that we all can benefit from. So I leave you in love, freedom, justice, and peace. Now let us work together to get it done.
We're
There you have it, another week, another show. Thanks for joining us on the Articles of ADOS podcast. Make sure to visit our website, articlesofados.com, where you can join our mailing list and see the show notes for today's episode.
Be sure to tune in next Friday for a new episode of Undiscussed News you may have missed. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, send us an email to listeners@articlesofados.com.
And remember, you can catch us live at 10 a.m. every Friday on WCRS 92.7 and 98.3 here in Columbus, Ohio. Also head over to our Patreon page to support the podcast as we give you weekly news and information important to our community. Until next time, family, stay safe and stay strong. Peace.
We're coming to get our check. We're coming to get our check. We're coming to get our check.